Hello and welcome to another video. Today's video will be on Plasma, a new game whose demo has been available for the past 2 weeks. This is a game all about constructing different mechanical devices using standard components like servos, pistons, motors, and even stuff like accelerometers and wireless transceivers. In this video, I'll be building a VR-controlled drone that has way more cameras than it needs, all while only using one transceiver. That doesn't sound impressive until you realize that is 8 cameras worth of images being sent on only 2 wireless connections. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, but I'll show you how I did that later on. For now, let's go back to the beginning. I was just as new to this game as everyone else was, so I didn't really know what to expect or what was possible, a theme that will come back very soon. I started building the plasma cannon launcher. I built a platform and then put some plasma cannons on it. I also hooked up this button so when you press it, it shoots the plasma cannons at the ground, launching the whole device up in the air. Wait, that isn't the right creation. Yeah, immediately back to the not sure what to expect point. This video was originally going to be called, Can You Fly Using Only Plasma Cannons? Unfortunately, I realized within 10 minutes that the answer to that question is a solid no. I found out that, while creations can be moved by their own cannons, it isn't the force of firing, but the explosion. That means a creation can't be launched any further once it's actually in the air, something I tested by making the whole creation neutrally buoyant and firing the cannons. It's not actually the plasma cannons that provide thrust, it's the explosion. This was actually pretty disappointing because there are quite a few videos that I wanted to, but I know I can't make now. I don't know if I can expect this in the final game or not, but I understand why they may not implement it. After that, the camera car wasn't even my second idea. After the plasma cannon one, I moved on to trying to make a plane with the wing part. I placed down a rectangular block with wings and servos on either side. Onto this I added some levers and thrusters to control the angle of the wings. I knew there was a wing part, but I didn't know if the game actually had aerodynamics implemented. I can say pretty confidently after testing this creation that no, there are no aerodynamics. I also did subsequent tests by dropping things with wings attached to see if it affected anything, and still the answer was no. Wing physics is actually something I think we can expect in the final game. Based on messages on their Discord, it just wasn't quite ready to be implemented in the demo, but don't take my word for that, I haven't looked into it too much. Finally, there's only one more idea before the camera drone. I wanted to make a small RC train track. This idea is different in that I didn't move on because it wasn't possible, but just because it was incredibly tedious. I wanted to try to make a monorail style thing, but it ended up being far too difficult to line up anything consistently with a track without just attaching it. I also tried making the rail much wider, but at the time I couldn't figure out how to attach a cube part at a point that wasn't the middle of a side. No matter what I did, I just attached at the middle, and that isn't really how tracks work. With all of that out of the way, I can actually get into what this build is about, the camera drone. The first thing I did was place down a platform with 8 cameras on it, each rotated so they made up a full circle and they could see 360 degrees. After doing some rearranging to make sure that they were properly spaced, I accidentally shrunk the platform down to 13%. Whoa. In doing this, I actually realized that there's pretty much no restrictions when it comes to collisions within parts, and I could have all 8 cameras in almost a one-tile space. I settled for this slightly clipping design because I like the way it looks. I started to do the programming next, and immediately noticed how many transceivers I would need if I wanted this to be entirely wireless. A transceiver is a tile you can place down to allow wireless communications, and if you look at the logic node for it, you can see it has 3 channels of input and output. That means you can only send 3 different signals at the same time. With 8 cameras, that means I would need at least 3 transceivers, and probably more than that if I also wanted to be able to move the drone wirelessly. This is why I wanted to try to send it all over a single transceiver, to save space and to just challenge myself. The first thing I did was try to make an indexer of sorts that would only allow a single camera at a time to send the signal. To test this, I placed down some lamps to see if I could get them to light up one at a time. I tried at first to use some flip-flop nodes, but this just made the lights turn on and off in more of a binary counter than an indexer. I then tried a few other things before settling on this ticker counter mapper setup. What this does is every tick increments the counter by 1, which, using the mapper, reroutes the on signal to a different light bulb. After 4 ticks, it resets the counter to do it again. This is actually the logic I ended up using on the control station and not the car, but it's important to understand either way. Now that I had the indexing working, I needed to figure out how to use that to select individual cameras instead of just turning lights on. I was trying to find a way to allow a signal through based on some value, and I found these selector nodes. The selectors do exactly what I just said. Based on an index value, they select a corresponding payload to send through. The payload in this case is the feed from the camera. I started by using 3 selector nodes. The first 2 had 3 cameras and the last one had only 2. The idea here is that there are 3 channels on the transceiver and 1 selector for each, effectively splitting each channel up for more inputs. I moved on to building the control station next, first placing down just a single cube. On this cube I added a controller and duplicated 8 screens, 1 for each camera, followed by a transceiver set to the same channel as the cars. After some messing around with the logic on this side, I went back to the car and realized it would make much more sense to split the first 2 channels into 4 cameras each instead of 3, 3, 2. This also opened up the 3rd channel to allow me to send the index value through, making selecting on the other side much easier. On the car side, I needed to take 8 cameras and feed that into 2 inputs, and now on this side I need to do the exact opposite, to take 2 inputs and turn that back into 8 screens. I showed you the logic before where I used the mapper to index between light bulbs, and I pretty much did the same thing on this side. Using the transceiver channel 1 and the index on channel 3, I split out the camera's feed to 4 screens. You can see that it didn't exactly work correctly, and some cameras were sideways while others didn't work at all. I quickly fixed the issue with the broken screen, but noticed that the sideways feed was actually because I placed the cameras on the car sideways. That wasn't something I could easily fix because Plasma doesn't allow you to rotate objects in that way. In the end, I preferred the taller feed anyway because with all the screens it was already pretty wide. After some complicated rotating, I hooked up the remaining screens and took a step back. There I am. You can see that it worked pretty well, although there is one downside to doing the cameras on one transceiver. Because it's alternating between the cameras every 4 ticks, each screen is actually only being rendered at a quarter of the frame rate the cameras are capable of. This isn't that big of a deal for a device that will move slowly like this one, but it is something to keep in mind. I rotated the screens around so they formed a circle and placed a seat down at the center so you could see all the way around. If you look closely, you can actually see that the screens are in the wrong order from left to right, so I spent 10 minutes fixing this by reversing this order and rotating them again. You probably noticed that my car doesn't exactly have the features that make it a car, something I fixed now. This was actually slightly difficult, because with an even number of cameras, I needed the forward direction to be split between 2 cameras. That would be fine, except I built the cameras in the wrong orientation for that. To fix this, I had to take another platform and attach it beneath the cameras at a minus 22.5 degree angle. Yeah, this isn't a perfect solution, but it works. Onto that platform, I added 4 single-axis joints for steering, followed by 4 motors, and then 4 wheels on top of that. Now it looks more like a car. Next, I got to work on the logic for actually controlling the car, for which I did have to add another transceiver. I actually ran into yet another issue here, because I had 4 inputs I wanted to transmit, W, A, S, and D, but only 3 channels. The solution to this problem was a bit easier though. What I did was make W and S send a 1 and a -1 for forward and backward respectively, and use the same concept for left and right. If you want to know how I did that, you can see the logic on screen for it here. Nothing too complicated. Now on the car side, I had to use those inputs to actually move the car. The first thing I did was connect some LCDs so that I could make sure the proper signals were being sent, and after seeing that they were, I just connected those to the motor speeds, multiplied by 1000, so it actually had some speed to it. After testing that and seeing that it worked, I did the exact same thing for rotating the single axis joints and tested it again. I've got a 360 car using only 2 transceivers. At this point, the car was actually completed, and I definitely could have just stopped here and achieved my goal, but I was having fun, so I decided to add some more stuff. The first thing I did was add a slider to control the car's speed, something I added just so I knew how fast it could go. I also remembered that I have 1 channel left on the control transceiver, so I used that same kind of logic as before and hooked up the space button to it. I didn't know what I would use it for yet, but I wanted to have it. Of course, my first thought was to add some boosters to the car, which I did by placing some thrusters on the back and turning them on when I pressed space. On testing, I drove by myself in the control pod and it was a super weird experience, like exiting from VR and seeing your robot self. Hello, Mr. Robot. The boosters did work, but they made the car hard to control and really unstable, so I decided to try adding some down thrust and increasing the wheel size to make it a rock climber. After testing this, I immediately did a double backflip and then bottomed it out on a rock. I tested it climbing the mountain behind me, which it did, and if I had more patience it would have been successful, but it was pretty slow. I added some LEDs to give you some feedback with what buttons I was pressing, and then saved everything because I was pretty much done. Well, I was done until I decided that I wasn't anymore. I randomly decided that I wanted to weaponize this car, so I removed the thrusters and added on a servo and single axis joint, onto which I of course placed a plasma cannon. I wasn't sure how I wanted to control the cannon, shoot it, and still move the car around, so I did some tinkering. The first thing I tried was this flip-flop and selector to swap modes, but I moved away from that. I ended up using 2 mappers, one for each control channel, and swapping between outputs using a flip-flop node every time I pressed space. I set up the left and right and up and down controls to move the cannon while I was in mode 2, and left everything on mode 1 as is. By the way, mode 1 is driving and mode 2 is cannon. I also ended up just making the cannon constantly shoot if I was in mode 2, making a continuous stream of plasma. So I can drive around just fine. I can stop. As soon as I press space, I now control the cannon and it just shoots. After firing plasma at the control station, then being amazed how I couldn't even tell I was hit, I had actually completed the build. I finished up by spending about 20 minutes organizing the logic traces, something I think is pretty therapeutic, and painting the creations. I gave it a couple final tests and called it good. With some footage of it working in the background, I'm going to talk about my thoughts on the game now. I had a ton of fun in the Plasma demo. It's an incredibly complex and yet easy to understand system of components and programming. As a software developer who loves robotics, this game is nearly my ideal sandbox. Now, with the understanding that this is only a demo, there are things I don't like about the game. The building system is actually slightly limited, only allowing pieces to connect in predefined locations, as was shown in my attempts to build a train track. I know there are ways to add sockets so you can do that, but the system overall is pretty complicated. Similarly limiting is the fact that creations don't actually collide with themselves. You can see in the background now that I did at one point try to build an engine, but it's simply not possible because there's no way to physically constrain the pistons on a single creation. I know that there are definitely reasons for everything I mentioned, and the game overall is focused on the programming aspect, but these are just things I noticed while playing. None of this is to say I don't like Plasma. On the contrary, it might be my favorite sandbox game I've ever played. There are definitely things that would be extremely nice to have though, and I'm very excited for the full release. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and feel free to subscribe. If you're interested in another video like this, you can click the card on screen or check out my channel. This car was so much fun to make, and it really shows such a small piece of what is possible in this game. It feels like I created a VR drone in Plasma, and it's very fun to drive around. If you want to see more Plasma videos or have any suggestions, let me know. The demo won't be live much longer, so no promises, but I'd be happy to hear them. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.